The views, assumptions, and opinions expressed by the Godfather hosts, guests, and callers on the program are strictly their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of Electrocast Media.
The Israeli elite, unfortunately, and this is where I get really critical, the Israeli elite, unfortunately, were very happy to ignore this. They happily ignored this problem. And so, we have to remember the 7th of October arrived in Israel after a period of terrible contestation over what is Israel. Yes, over the character, the kind of core character of Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, as a nation state, as a democratic state. These things, they are interconnected. Now, I've been to so many of these speeches by Israeli leaders who told us how we are a strong, successful, vibrant state, yes, without actually addressing the core problem, which is that our story has run out of steam and we have to come up with a new story.
Welcome to the Godfather Wars, the real talk on understanding how geopolitics impacts you and your world. We're your hosts,
Barak,
and I'm Leah Tedrow. Thank you for joining us as we take a deep dive behind the topics affecting the world we live in today. Welcome back to the show where we'll be discussing the war in Israel in a 4-part series. Today, our series begins with a look at how we got here and the information battle space. Later in the show, we'll be joined by our special guest, Dr. Vera Michlin-Shapir, Director of Education at the Symposium Institute for Strategic Communications, where we'll be discussing the Hamas-led information battle space and Israel's failing communications counter-approach on a global scale, and a brief look at what led to the attack on Israel on October 7th. Our usual segments of what this means to you and who's who in The Godfather, where Barak will discuss which countries are emulating the traits of characters from The Godfather, will follow. It's a packed agenda today. So with that, let's get started. Barak, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a while since we spoke and we've had a podcast out there, but we've had very busy lives of late.
And it's not necessarily been fun with everything that's just flared up.
No, it's been a very crazy world, seeming to go from one conflict to the other, which leads us into our conversation about the October 7th attacks. And I think for context, we need to bring, our viewers up to speed on the timeline of the Israel-Gaza conflict and kind of what led to this. And I think I'm not going to go back to 1947 and start talking about there because that's a whole episode in and of itself. But I think if we kind of go back to the birth of Hamas, which was in the first Palestinian uprising in 1987, that is the year that Hamas was formed. Fast forward a few years, and in 1993, we have the Oslo Accords, which were signed, and Gaza was then given semi-autonomy, and the Palestinian Authority was formed. From there, on September 12th of 2005, the Israeli cabinet formally declared an end to Israeli military occupation of the Gaza Strip. And then in 2006, Hamas scored a surprising victory in Palestinian parliamentary elections and seized full control of Gaza, overthrowing forces loyal to Arafat's successor, President Mahmoud Abbas. Following that, much of the international community then cut aid to the Palestinians in Hamas-controlled areas because they regarded Hamas as a terrorist organization. And they are recognized as a terrorist organization by the UK, the US, and the EU. And then off the back of that, Israel stopped tens of thousands of Palestinian workers from entering the country, cutting off an important source of income. Israeli airstrikes then crippled Gaza's only electrical power plant, causing widespread blackouts. And then citing security concerns, Israel and Egypt also imposed tighter restrictions on the movement of people and goods through the Gaza crossing. And Hamas's ambitious goals and plans to refocus Gaza's economy east away from Israel foundered before they even started. And viewing Hamas as a threat, Egypt's military-backed leader, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who took power in 2014, closed the border with Gaza and blew up most of the tunnels, some of which are obviously alive and well, considering, the issues that we have with current on-the-ground operations with Israel. And they also, in 2014, closed the border with Gaza, as I said, and blew up most of the tunnels, once again isolating Gaza, and Gaza's economy went into reverse. And then we have the conflict cycle, which started. Gaza's economy has suffered repeatedly in the cycle of conflict, attack and a retaliation between Israel and Palestinian terrorist groups. And before 2023, some of the worst fighting was in 2014 when Hamas and other groups launched rockets at heartland cities in Israel, and Israel carried out airstrikes and artillery bombardment that devastated neighborhoods in Gaza. More than 2,100 Palestinians were killed, mostly civilians, and Israel put the number of its dead at 67 soldiers and 6 civilians. After that, this leads us to the surprise attack on the 7th of October, which is where we are today. So that is just a very quick snapshot timeline. We could go into extreme detail and other things that have happened within that. But I think that just gives us a good sort of timeline of where and how this has come about since Hamas has come into power and since Gaza was given semi-autonomy from the Oslo Accords. So this now leads us to 7 October and what happened on that day.
So, Leah, you mentioned a summary of the history that has taken place in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To a degree, I don't see this as an extension of that. And I think it was incredibly naive and ignorant of somebody like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to say that we have to identify this from the context in which it took place, which is occupation. There was no inevitability of this. Israel had withdrawn from Gaza 17 years ago, and it's been commented frequently that instead of developing skyscrapers like Singapore, the Palestinians took international aid and developed an extensive network of tunnels underground. Their entire economy has been predicated on terrorism, and their nationalism has evolved into being one that is predicated on genocidal intentions. That's not an extension of a nationalist aspiration. That's not an extension of resisting occupation. That's something which is a lot more primal and bloodthirsty.
I don't disagree with you. And I think if we're looking at this and we are looking at the cause, if you want to look at the causation of this, Hamas, once they came into power in their charter, it says that they want to eradicate Israel and all Jews. I mean, they are a recognized terrorist organization by the US, by the UK, and by the EU. And I think Hamas and their actions have created enormous and catastrophic casualties on both sides, right? The atrocities, the unspeakable atrocities that have been committed in Israel are just horrific on a level that I never thought we would see in the 21st century. But then when they also then use Palestinians as human shields, when they're hiding in schools and hospitals, and they don't seem to care that the Palestinian people have become collateral damage in the retaliation that Israel has perpetrated in defense of their own sovereign state. So I think when you're looking at this conflict, it's important to remember that there are innocent people on both sides of the fence here, right? And that the real criminals here is Hamas. They're the ones that coordinated and created this attack against Israel, the ones that perpetrated the crimes against civilians in Israel. And as a result, they knew that they were not going to have a military victory. I think they went in there and they committed these atrocities to provoke an aggressive response against Israel so that they could then leverage that in their cause. And they have seen thousands of innocent women and children in Gaza killed as a result of this. They have blocked roads when Israel has given warnings that they're going to strike someplace so that those people can't leave, so that they can increase civilian casualties and death. This has factually been documented and verified by UN resources, by news and media sources, by the governments that have seen these things happen. So I think it is important to remember who is actually perpetrating these crimes.
It prompts me to question why there is no international outcry regarding this. Why, if this is indeed documented, why the people that are going on these marches on behalf of the Palestinians aren't genuinely outspoken on behalf of Palestinian civilians that are taken as human shields?
Yeah, I think there's polarization, right? I think there's polarization of everyone feels they have to take a side. And this is why I think the most surprising outcome of this is that there's not anti-Hamas protests everywhere and that everyone is trying to stop it, that this has become an Israeli-Palestinian thing, because I think there's a long history of that. And, more to your point, that I don't think that this was really necessarily about occupation or anything else like that. I think this is a terrorist organization doing what terrorist organizations do, and it's creating mass chaos, mass casualties on both sides of the fence.
I would just take it a bit further. When you speak about, simple narrative, people just want to take a side in an oversimplistic manner. When people aren't galvanized by the massacres of Kurds in northern Iraq, or when they're not galvanized by Putin carpet bombing Syrians with white phosphorus, And they have no problem with the Uyghur women being sterilized in concentration camps in Xinhua. It just prompts me to think, okay, why are they so fixated on the Palestinian issue? And while at the same time not genuinely caring about Palestinian civilians. And the obvious answer is that's because the Jewish state is part of the equation here, and it's not part of the equation in any of the other conflicts. And it was Martin Luther King that said that when people say that they hate Israel, what they really mean is that they hate Jews. And the irony of Zionism is that it came about in order to be an antidote to anti-Semitism, but it really allowed anti-Semitism to mutate from an ethnic to nationalistic level. So today people don't say, I hate Jews, but they can say, I'm critical of Israel, but their criticism of Israel is a disproportionate criticism that seeks to demonize Israel, as opposed to legitimately critiquing Israeli policies in the same manner that they would critique policies of other members of the international community. And that, for me, is modern anti-Semitism.
I think that then leads us into the fact that everything that Israel has done has been in a defensive mode, except on the communications platform. They have done nothing to help themselves in the media and the press throughout its entire history. And that's even more so in this. They are losing the information war space. The strategic communications of this, there is none. They are, again, put in a defensive position. They have nothing offensively that they're putting forth on information media platforms, and they're being completely beaten in getting their side of the story out. They're just not effective as far as it comes to communications, which I think leads us into the conversation that we have with our special guest today, who is now joining us. We're very honored to have Dr. Vera Michlin-Shapir, Director of Education at the Symposium Institute for Strategic Communications, join us. She's worked at Israel's National Security Council, was a research fellow at the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, Israeli Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs, the Israeli Intelligence and Commemoration Center, and was a visiting research fellow and lecturer at the King's College Center for Strategic Communications and War Studies Department. Welcome so very much to the show, Dr. Vera.
Hi, Leah. Hi, Barak.
Well, just kick off with the fact that Israel's revolutionized an integrated approach to warfare. There's an enhanced integration between the collection of human intelligence, signal intelligence, satellite intelligence, cyber intelligence, air force surveillance that is distributed to artillery, drone, air force, tank units, navy units to support maneuvering forces and reduce frictions so that strikes can be conducted with minimal contact with Hamas. And there's no doubt that this will be used as a model for future warfare. So the US military will be studying this. And an example of this integrated approach to warfare is an intelligence coming through to the IDF Unit 401 when it was about to be ambushed by Hamas. And this information came from an intelligence center through a targeting center, then to the Navy, which fired a dozen shells from a missile boat, killing the targets. And as a result of this integrated approach to warfare, Israel has conducted nearly 4,500 strikes against Hamas operational command and control centers, weapon production facilities, anti-tank missile launch posts, terrorist infrastructure sites, and destroying over 300 tunnel shafts. And the question really is, with this integrated approach to warfare, is Israel able to make headway, A, to the tunnels under the north of Gaza, and B, into the south of Gaza, where Khan Yunis is and where Ehud Olmert has said is command and control of Hamas? Now, as the IDF has told everybody to shift southwards, many Hamas operatives would have shifted southwards along with civilian populations, which makes that even more densely populated. So it's kind of lose-lose, is it not?
Well, I think that the current ceasefire draws the line there, right, between, say, phases of the operation. And I think that this timing, obviously the timing was also ripe for an exchange of hostages, which is an enormously sensitive issue within the Israeli society. I mean, we will speak later about the informational aspects of fighting and war, and definitely the psychological ones. So the Israeli society is extremely traumatized by the events of 7th of October, and also still remains traumatized by the fact that there are still hostages remaining. So the operation has kind of, right, we're going from phase one, which was more limited to the north. And now it feels a little bit like we're also in this showdown, right? So it's a military showdown, but also a political one, because obviously the military, senior figures both in the Israeli military and in the Israeli security agencies, usually after they leave office, because of the restraints they have while they're in office, after they leave office, they're very clear about it, that the Israeli army can solve many problems, many military problems for the state of Israel, but it can't solve political problems for the state of Israel. It's not what militaries do. So it's a showdown. This is now really a place that is not only the military would have to show how it can fight in an integrated way, and how, as Secretary of State Blinken said, that also would have to further limit civilian casualties, but also the Israeli political establishment would have to show that it has the capabilities, that it has the political flexibility, and also the stamina to bring down Hamas as the actor that calls the shots in Gaza, and also would have a different solution. And for that different solution, you need quite a lot of, as I said, political will, political energy, also some level of flexibility of who would come in and what this political situation would look like in Gaza.
So, Vera, I wanted to ask you a question. On October 7th, a lot of the military commanders and Israeli commanders have come out and said it was a massive intel failing, that there were numerous indicators that were actually ignored. And I just wanted to ask, what is your response to that? And what do you think led to that failure, that intelligence failure? Because, Israel has some of the most advanced technological intelligence tools, and they employ some of the most advanced methodologies in their intelligence gathering. And there were indicators, and they were reported up, and they were ignored. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are and how that was allowed to happen, do you think, with the IDF?
Well, you say that victory or success has many fathers, mothers, and failure is an orphan. But I think that actually with failures, and with failures of such magnitude that we've seen on the 7th of October, it's usually a multi-level, multi-layered problems that add up and bring you to a place where you are really faced with such a terrible outcome for yourself. To name a few, we could see that Barak was laying out this kind of very technological approach, right? Integrated technological approach to intelligence, which may, in some cases, and we don't know, obviously there will be a thorough commission that will thoroughly investigate this intelligence failure, but there are those who say that over-reliance on technology is often a problem, because you need the human assessment. You need a human assessment to add value to technology. That is one thing. Another issue, I believe, is that we have our framework, our conceptions, right, of how we view reality. And these are, with such a situation with intelligence assessment, they are framed, or they become conceptions in interaction in between the military and the political establishment. And there was a very strong incentive for the military not to be bothered with Gaza too much. Yes, there was a very strong incentive there for the Israeli intelligence establishment not to be too bothered with this, because a solution seemed impossible. There seemed to be not enough legitimacy to go in and change things in a more profound way. And so when you don't have a solution to a problem, often what you find yourself is trying to, in your own mind, to try and minimize it, right? It's a kind of group psychology there. So there are kind of these circles of silence, right? If everyone around the table agrees on something and you disagree, if you are in a minority, you need to have a very strong culture of argument in order to come up and say, hey, guys, this is not what is going to happen. And this brings me to the last point, and this is the culture issue. I mean, in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, there was a big kind of rethink of how intelligence is being assessed, not gathered, because it is being gathered very well, but how intelligence is being assessed within the Israeli intelligence establishment. And that started a very interesting conversation on intelligence analysis methodologies. One of the outcomes of which was that the Israeli intelligence analysis included an element called Ipcha Mistabra, which comes from Talmudic tradition of actually it's an Aramaic saying that means on the contrary, reality appears otherwise, which means that you can't just accept the prevailing intelligence assessment. You have to argue with that assessment, and you have to look at the same facts and try and find a different interpretation to these facts, because this is what we all do. This is how conceptions are being born, is that we see facts and we create an interpretation of these facts. And so, unfortunately, a specific unit was created within the Israeli Intelligence Directorate, and this is something that's been written on recently. And actually, I am in the process of finishing a book, an edited volume on that subject, on the fact that an approach that challenges the prevailing conception is a matter of culture. It's not an institutional issue. You have to integrate a culture where hierarchy is not enough in order to make a final decision. You have to hear what people have to say, you have to take it into account, and you have to allow people to argue. And I think that this is the cultural side here.
Sorry, Vera, just to interject, Israelis aren't the most agreeable people in the world. And I think it's probably connected to the fact that it doesn't have a strategic culture. While it is tactically, technologically, and operationally flexible and innovative, it doesn't have a sense of long-term strategic thinking. Everything is very ad hoc. You had a great way, you once expressed to me that Israel is acted upon, reality imposes itself. Can you just repeat that statement that you said?
Yeah, I mean, but the idea of lack of strategic culture, and I mean, we can argue where there is really a strategic culture, right? Because it's a big term. But the idea is that you see the reality and you say, I'm going to go and change and shape and shift. And Israelis don't have that approach, right? And that is indeed, Barak, a problem. It's like what I said is that reality happens to Israel and not Israel happens to reality. Yes. So you are constantly reactive, right? And if we want to kind of transition to the informational side of things, it's also the fact that, for instance, a good example is that in Israel, your communications efforts with the outside world are called hasbara, which is explaining. But explaining is against reactive. Something happened, and then you explain it. So it's a whole mindset of you're a small country, you're a small actor, there are bigger things that are happening, bigger things at play, and you're just reacting to them.
Well, this leads me into the fact that Israel is losing the information battle space. I mean, we started seeing the sort of information warfare really sort of coming into its own in the Iraq War, when al-Qaeda really started outstripping the coalition forces with doing that. I mean, we ran into those problems, quite often, where it was like al-Qaeda was able just to push out content, and far outstripping it. And then you have, the coalition, which they're like, okay, well, we need to go through so many approval processes. We need to, do that. And by the time you hit the news cycle, it's irrelevant. And I think Israel is finding that same problem right now. We spoke to a few experts recently over the week, and they said, the problem is we're bound by truth. We have to verify facts, and we have to do, sort of all of these things. And I said, well, would it not be an approach that you need to take is that you've recently integrated intelligence officers into all of your units on the kinetic side of things, and now you need to look at the non-kinetic. Would it not be a fair assumption to learn from the lessons that we've had and say, maybe we need information officers on the ground with these units as well, so that we can stop being in a completely offensive position and move into defense for once and for a change, and get out in front of that? Because they recently said, well, look, Hamas just said we killed 500 people in the hospital. We went back and we explained that wasn't the case, and we verified. And I said, but you've missed the news cycle and nobody cares. Nobody. And they said, well, if you want to find the truth, you research. And I said, unfortunately, people in this day and age are lazy. Nobody goes to research. They're just interested in headlines, and they read those headlines and then they move on and the next thing in the next news cycle. So I'm interested to hear, your opinions about what Israel actually needs to do to sort of combat this information battle space, because they are losing horrifically on the court of public opinion. on this, which is the opposite of what should be happening. But I mean, that's where they are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it nicely connects with Barak's interjection with strategic culture, because in the West, in the aftermath, especially in the aftermath of the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the West, the prevailing term is not information warfare, it is strategic communications, right? So what Western countries are doing is strategic communications. But the most important part, in my opinion, or the first part, which is strategic, is extremely important. In order to do, Leah, what you just described, in order to go out there and shape the conversations, you have to be strategic. You have to have a strategy. You have to know where you want to shift the conversation. So it's not reality happens to you, something happens, and you are just the spokesperson that spins around and explains it in your favor. You are going out there and you're going to change the conversations. You're going to change perceptions and hopefully also change behaviors. And this requires strategic thinking. What is your big story? Yes. And how does your big story, how would you see your big story playing out there with audiences? And that is the kind of thinking that unfortunately Israel did not accept for itself. And I think that there are two reasons why it wasn't integrated. One is that there is still a sense that it's just not important enough, that kinetic force, that actions on the ground, military actions are more important than the information space. And then you say to yourself, well, if it's not important for you, and the kind of attitude in Israel is like, okay, I'm just going to do whatever I think is right. I'm going to do it. And no matter what other people are saying. And then 10 years later, they look around and there aren't many people who are supporting them. Well, that's not a surprise, right? You haven't put your back into it too much. And the other issue is that I think you do need a big picture kind of approach to this, and you need a whole of government effort there. And we see that in the West, in NATO allied countries, that many of them learned the hard way that it's not enough to have an information officer with the units. You need them to feed into somewhere that has the strategic picture, that has an understanding of where they want the conversation to go, so it can enable their military actions, right? So it can enable their political solutions that they want to put in place. And then they use these different facts and figures that are coming from the ground, and they can build a picture for audiences. Otherwise, it's just a mess, right?
It sounds like the root of the problem here is the governance structure of Israel, in that the governance structure, being proportional representation, doesn't lend itself to long-term strategic thinking. And, now the fact that we've become so technologically advanced, we want to eliminate the fog of war. And as you said earlier, that it shouldn't be siloed political, military, or over-reliance on technology versus human intelligence, or kinetic versus non-kinetic. They need to be integrated. And it seems as if Israel lacks that capability. And not only does it prevent Israel to address the day after in Gaza, which creates a schism between it and the United States, but it impacts on the way warfare is being conducted now, because there isn't a capability of winning hearts and minds. Israel lacks that informational arm to strip the Palestinian public away from Hamas.
I think it goes deeper than that, Barak, to be honest with you. I think it is because Israel is always just putting fires out. Every single day they're putting fires out. And I think that they haven't had the time to even consider or know what their story is. I don't think that they actually understand or know what it is that they want to project to the world, what that story is, and what those outcomes need to be. And I agree with Vera. The first thing that you have to do is you have to have a strategy, but that strategy is pinned on what do we want the outcome to be? What is the story that we're trying to tell here? And I don't think that Israel knows what that story is, because I think they've been, defensive and defending themselves from the outset of their existence as a state. And I think that, they've never had that time. And I think, to Vera's point, they're just like, that's not important because I'm trying to survive. Right. It's been 70 years of survival, but they haven't learned the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, where the coalition forces went in those places and said, we're losing, the sentiment and the support of the people. And we're actually driving anti-coalition, sort of sentiment here. What do we need to do? And they went back to the drawing board and they said, we have to merge the non-kinetic with the kinetic. We have to get the information communication space on board with the military actions, the governmental actions, getting people to understand what is my duties as a citizen? What exactly is democracy? And if I continue to support militias and terrorist groups with their indiscriminate killing, I will never have a state that I can call my own. They're not going to build me hospitals. They're not going to build roads. They're not going to build schools. And it was a massive re-education. But they knew what the story was, is that we want to have a sovereign state. We want to be at peace. We want to provide, we want to have a democratic sort of led kind of country. So they knew what the end state story was. And I don't think Israel has figured that out yet.
I agree, but I would take it even to a more fundamental place that Israel, as opposed to America, in its founding, it had the luxury of being shielded between two oceans, and it had, not to be facetious, the luxury of having a civil war in order to determine what its identity was going to be, culminating in a declaration of independence and codified constitution, separation of powers, an institutional nationalism. Israel went to war on the day of its founding, and its inability to create a narrative and in turn create a coherent strategy, a long-term strategy, and in this case, what's for the day after, or how it impacts on warfare, stripping away the public away from Hamas. It's actually linked to something more fundamental, that Israel doesn't have a coherent identity. It's not defined what Jewish is. It doesn't know how Jewish and democracy complement one another in a seamless manner. You have two ends of a political spectrum, one emphasizing the liberal democratic features, and that the Jewish identity will be relegated to that. So that would be the left of the spectrum. And the right of the spectrum is emphasizing the Jewish features and how the democratic functions will be relegated to that. And I think the lack of identity impacts on inability to create a narrative, inability to communicate that narrative, which impacts on not only the long-term strategic goals, but the impact of the fighting on the ground in the very present moment.
I think, if I may jump in, and I don't particularly like being in this fundamentally critical position. Obviously I'm Israeli, and I don't like being in a fundamentally critical position towards what happened and what the Israeli elites didn't do in recent years. But because Israel is in a war, and of course I want everything to go smoothly and well for Israel. But the problem is, and I agree with both of you, it's a bigger problem. It's a problem that goes to the core of Israeli identity. Now, identity is never set, right? Identity is always developing. It's also always being reproduced. So Israel had quite a good, compelling story to tell about itself, which was the Zionist story, which was the return of the Jewish people from exile to their historic land and building a strong and successful sovereign state with a strong military, technology, economy, and so on. And so what we've seen in the last at least 20 years is that actually happened. It materialized. So what happens after you have your happy ending? And the idea was that...
Sorry to interrupt. That story in and of itself, though, is insufficient when the international community, when history has shifted away from nation states of sort of homogenous demographics. Israel was one of the last nation states to be created, right?
Yeah, but I think the problem was, and you're right. The problem was there are several layers to this problem, but really the problem is that after you've done that, then what? And the idea was that this story ran out of steam. And that's why you have competing interests and competing understandings that started to contest this, because the story is just not strong enough. And the Israeli elite, unfortunately, and this is where I get really critical, the Israeli elite, unfortunately, were very happy to ignore this. They happily ignored this problem. And so, we have to remember the 7th of October arrived in Israel after a period of terrible contestation over what is Israel. Yes, over the character, the kind of core character of Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, as a nation state, as a democratic state. And all these things, they are interconnected. Now, I've been to so many of these speeches by Israeli leaders who told us how we are a strong, successful, vibrant state, yes, without actually addressing the core problem, which is that our story has run out of steam. And we have to come up with a new story. So, Barak, you were mentioning the political system, right? The proportional representation. Also, the fact that Israel doesn't have a constitution, right? It's very hard to come up with a strategy and a good picture for yourself, for your future, if you don't have a constitution. So I think what happened is that, well, basically, in many ways, us as Israelis, we were too comfortable. We were too comfortable with situations that we should have been very uncomfortable with. Yes, and we should have got back to work. But going back to the strategy and the information war, these things, when your story doesn't add up, it's very hard to tell that story to outside audiences, right? I mean, when you don't have a clear picture of where you're going, and this is what Leah was saying about how you convince audiences that they should do what you think is right. Yes, or they should believe, or they should think what you think is right. Please have some kind of understanding to your side. And there are two things you really need to do is figure out for yourself. And the other thing is also, and this is also extremely important, is also figure out what is interesting for those audiences. And in Israel, there is, unfortunately, on the side of information, and I think that some of it maybe is because of the kind of difficult history that Israel has with various nation states around it and so on. There is a sense that, those that are with us, and those who are against us, and there's not much you can do about it. I think it's wrong. I think there is much you can do about it. If you understand people and if you have a good story to tell, you will find audiences that would listen to you.
But I think as a result of the lack of identity, Israel, by dint of that, it just emphasizes the tactical, operational, and technological. That's what it really drills down deeply into, to innovate into that at the expense of everything else. And, we see it in this conflict that in contrast to the 2006 Lebanon war, where the IDF relied on the Air Force to strike at Hezbollah, ground troops afterwards were sent to confront Hezbollah, and it was a challenge for the IDF to coordinate the units. And now, in this conflict, access to the various forms of intelligence to find targets from intercepted signals come from people on the ground. And these targets could include individual terrorists or buildings or vehicles, and officers conduct wireless monitors, online analysis, photo, video analysts, researchers, and interrogators. They contribute to a target bank that yields tactical operational results. And so you do see only in the sphere of the operational and the technological this type of integration and a lack of silos between various functions. It's still not happening between the political and the technical and the military. But on the military side, this integration is made possible by new technology that enhances command and control while sifting through intelligence and data gathered on the battlefield, so that it totally slashes down the amount of time it takes for the IDF to close the loop and swiftly, from enemy identification, swiftly neutralize the threat. So one team can identify a threat while the other neutralizes the threat. And there's a seamlessness that takes place, but that's only happening within the realm of the military and the technological. It's not enough, and it won't unless you integrate political strategy. It's no coincidence that in the US Secretary of State, according to the Constitution, has to be a civilian. And when there was a Secretary of Defense that came from the military, that was highly controversial. But having that political arm to the military is something that Israel lacks.
Vera, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, because Israel is also very good at picking up the best practices of other militaries and what they're doing, and incorporating that into their techniques, their methodologies, and to their operations. And I'm just curious as to why they've never picked up the information operations piece of this. You know what I mean? They've seen how valuable that has been to coalition forces in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and the amount of effort that's gone with it. And they've seen the outcomes of that, in getting the support of the people or cooperation. We saw that with the Anbar Awakening in Iraq and numerous other examples. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts of why the Israeli military has never embraced that portion of it.
First of all, I'm not sure to what extent the success that the US military and that other NATO allied countries had with strategic communications. I'm not sure to what extent this was communicated or that was accepted by Israel. And again, people can see things that you do and they can see that you're successful and say, great, I'm really happy for you that you've made this, right? But it goes through their own lens and they would say to themselves, I think 9 out of 10 say, okay, this is what they need to do because they are doing something else here. But I am in a different world and I don't necessarily need that. So I think that's one thing. I'm certain that they saw it. Yes, I know that they saw it. But I'm not sure within their own lens that they apply to themselves and what they need, not necessarily accepted, or it didn't go all the way to the top, to the working level to make sure that these things are happening. I think the other thing, and this is what I mentioned with Stratcom, right, that it's even if the Israeli military on some level, and I don't think it happened on all levels, but on some level, even if the Israeli military understood the potential of Stratcom, the practice of Stratcom is so complex. It requires such a shift in your mental approach to your audiences, right? It's just such a revolution that you have to do within your mind that it's actually very hard to do for something that maybe you're not necessarily, as an Israeli, you're not necessarily sure that you will have a good yield out of that. And the other thing is that remember, Leah, that in the United States, this happened within the military, but it also happened within the political establishment. So the political establishment was there to support the military in their effort to make this to revolutionize their own thinking about their military operations. I mean, the Obama administration was, for instance, extremely interested in strategic communications. I mean, with the hearings and Barack Obama himself coming out with a definition of strategic communications. So you see a political establishment that, it doesn't matter what you think about this political establishment, about the Obama administration, but you have the military has the support, it has the backing of the political establishment that says, yes, this is important. We will also put our minds to that. Definitely the case in the UK. Yes, definitely the case in the UK where
I would agree with you. And just to prove your point even more, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan working on various strategic communications campaigns, I think it was a massive mindset change for the military, the US military, to do that, because up until that point, it was all like, we only want to talk about the good things, the fluffy rainbow unicorn type stories. You know what I mean? And for us to turn around and say, you have to talk about the realities on the ground. And you also have to address the mea culpas, right? And you have to address what is actually happening out there. And it was very difficult, because there was definitely a shift in thinking that, in order for people to believe you, in order to gain credibility, you have to have sincerity, and it has to be backed with what's happening, their realities, and everything else like that. And I think that was very difficult for them to swallow. And they quickly got into their stride. But I think that shift change from going from quote unquote decades of propaganda, for lack of a better term, and shifting that into information operations, which then shifted into hearts and minds, was a very big step for them. And so I get exactly what you're saying. And you were absolutely right. They did have the political backing. Later on, political interference when things were going well, which completely changed everything for everyone. But that's a different episode altogether. But that is difficult, and change is hard. And to your point, I can see exactly why Israel is like, we're not ready for that, because we're just trying to get through this portion. And it's like, when we have a pause, then maybe we'll think about it. And that pause has just never come, I don't think.
That's the point, right? The pause never comes. And when the pause comes, and that's another point I think that is important to make, and this is something, again, that the US and UK and other allied forces learned, is that there's never a pause. Right?
Yeah.
Once you stop telling the story, someone else starts telling the story for you.
Yeah.
So there is never a pause, and there is a long-term aspect to it, which is, again, goes back to the strategy, right? It's a long-term aspect. So what I am most fearful of, is that this war is going to end at some point. I mean, it will end at some point, right? sooner or later. And then everything that happened will be filed in the back of people's minds. And it will just be forgotten. And then when the next problem comes along, it will be a completely new problem. It's not a completely new problem. Whatever is being reported now about Israel is a result of everything that's been done, everything that's been said, everything that's been communicated by Israel and about Israel in the international press. And now we have to deal with all of it, right?
Right.
So as you said, that's reactive. And that reactive approach and that lack of strategic culture, lack of communications, etc., that will enable Hamas to reconstitute itself to Hamas 2.0 or another radical organization. It won't eliminate the radicalization that is there. And it precludes there to be a political solution.
A political solution, but also, Barak, I mean, going back to what Leah was saying about the events in the El Ali hospital, right? When the international press immediately goes to Hamas and gets Hamas' version of events and publishes it as if this is what happened. Now, Israelis are like, well, why do you believe Hamas and don't believe us? But the answers, I mean, I invite you to go and listen to that press conference that Daniel Agari, the IDF spokesperson, had that night with journalists. And they're telling you, well, in the past, you used to lie to us, right? And these lies, they are filed with us. And you have to establish a new relationship with us if you want us to take you seriously. So it's a long-term process, and everything that's being said and how it's being said and how it's being reported is being filed into this collective memory that has layers and layers and layers. And when you open up, right, when a new event happens for Israel, it's not a new event. It's the sum of all the events, everything that's been said so far. And just going back to the strategic side of things, yeah. So, for instance, I was a very strong advocate when the war in Ukraine started. I was a very strong advocate of Israel taking a more proactive part in helping Ukraine. This was reality is not happening to us because this has nothing to do with us directly. This is us happening to reality. This is us going into the world, into the big wide world, making a stance and shaping and shifting attitudes and behaviors of audiences, but also attitudes of behaviors of states, right? Creating stronger bonds with our allies in a newly developing situation where one sovereign state attacked another sovereign state in a war of aggression without unprovoked, right? And there were so many opportunities that Israel could A, do the right thing, and B, change its strategic posture on the international arena. And every time the answer was, we can't get into this because this is not directly related to us, because there were all these excuses about, maintaining a relatively amicable relationship with Russia, which is in Syria, not seeing the bigger picture, which is that Israel is actually a strong military actor in the Middle East. The Russians are taking Israel seriously, but they also have another ally, and they have an ally that is becoming a strategic one, which is Iran. So the strategic situation is shifting, and you have to go out there and actively reshape things in your favor. But the idea is that if it doesn't press on me, it doesn't have anything to do directly to me, I'm not going to go out there and shape and shift things.
What they don't understand is that they may have less going on at home if they did get involved on a larger picture, because it gives them more credibility, more gravitas, gives them more strength, and they're seen as a stronger sort of platform in the Middle East. And this kind of leads me into the next thing, is that in a recent interview, right, I want to ask your opinion about this, because I think my question is, how does Israel turn it around in this next portion? So Elon Musk was asked recently when he said, how does this conflict end? And what do we see minimizing human suffering in that part of the world? And his response was, the goal of Hamas was to provoke an overreaction from Israel. They obviously did not expect to have a military victory, but they wanted to commit the worst atrocities they could in order to provoke the most aggressive response possible from Israel, and then leverage that aggressive response to rally Muslims worldwide for the cause of Gaza and Palestine, which they have succeeded in doing. Where and how does Israel combat that? Because we understand the complexities on the ground in getting rid of Hamas and dealing with what they're doing, and the massive media leverage that Hamas is now using specifically in those kinetic sort of activities. So in that statement is one, do you agree with it? And two, where does Israel go from there?
Well, first of all, I think it's very hard for me to comment on anything that comes out of Elon Musk's mouth.
He's like the worst possible person I could have picked to quote. I get it. So,
but I think he gave a kind of a good rundown, right? Of a kind of, if you think about it as a kind of almost like game scenarios, right? I mean, almost like a game theory where you have a certain game that is being played and it is being played very nicely in lab conditions, right? But obviously the situation is quite different. And I mean, I think there is a place for such analysis. You can argue that, this was a kind of an act of propaganda of the deed, right? Like a kind of when you are using your opponent's strength against them, right? So making someone overreact and then they lose legitimacy. But I think that there are other things that are intervening here. And one of the things that are intervening here is that Hamas is a Palestinian organization. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a Palestinian organization. Their goal is the Palestinian people. And if Hamas's leadership forgot that, then the Palestinian people may remind them that. And at the end of the day, if they will lose, and I think that it is likely that Israel will have enough legitimacy and the military will have enough steam to make Hamas lose control over Gaza, go into many years of hiding, and also reiterates to other Israeli allies that Hamas is not an organization to really do business with, then where does that lead them, right? I mean, if they lose that, you can have many kind of philosophical discussions, and it may be a good intellectual exercise to think about how this will change world politics and how it will incite this kind of, whole world pro-Palestinian sentiment. But at the end of the day, the people who are marching in solidarity with Palestine, they will go back to their own lives. And the Palestinian people will go back to their own lives. And Hamas will go back to the situation that it puts itself in, which is that it pushed itself outside the realm of legitimacy. So, I mean, if they ever had a chance to kind of come in as an actor that would actually have some kind of say over the future of the Palestinian people, I think that they made a major error by this attack. Again, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a political reality.
So what happens to Israel next on I would say, a public opinion sort of stage? How does Israel come back from this?
I think actually where Israel will come back from this is not on the public opinion. I think a lot of the conversations that we're having right now, they're a little bit kind of post-mortem, right? I mean, there are things that are already not going to happen. They're not going to happen to Israel within the current state. And it is very important to remember that the 7th of October happened after a really terrible rupture within the Israeli society. And I think Israel comes back to that. Israel doesn't come back to the international arena. Israel goes back home. And I think one thing that I constantly hear from my family and friends in Israel and my colleagues in Israel, and these are the conversations that we're having, which is that we will not be the same after this is finished. Yes, I mean, Hamas will not be the same. Hamas has to understand that they will not be the same. Yes, and I think that the people on the ground among Hamas, they feel it. The leadership, Hamas leadership abroad, may be gloating, and they may think that they can continue their comfortable lives. But I'm sure that at some point, these comfortable lives are not going to be so comfortable anymore. But Israel needs, and I think people understand and will go back and speak to each other about the big issues that we discussed. Because all these problems that we just laid out, all of them stem from lack of meaningful dialogue within the Israeli society. And meaningful dialogue means that you speak to people you disagree with. And there wasn't any of that. There was a lot of politicking, there was a lot of manipulation, and there wasn't a lot of meaningful dialogue. And I think that Israelis are ready for that, because on the 7th of October, it seemed like everything was lost. I mean, we're talking about stories, right? About identity and stories. It's heartbreaking. I mean, the state of Israel Zionism came about, so Jews will not be massacred and beheaded and raped, and then nothing happens, right? So And this is what people experienced on the 7th of October. So it was a kind of rupture within their story. So the story needs to be retold. And first of all, before you tell it to others, you need to tell it to yourself. I think from everything I hear from Israel and from everything I feel from Israel, and again, I'm not based there right now, but I am obviously very much part of many conversations. So I think Israelis are ready for that. Yes. And ready for a new conversation to start within Israel. And then hopefully taking on board everything we said here and being able to also communicate in a better way with people who are friends, right? These are many of these audiences that we're talking about. These are people who are our friends and our allies. And then we can speak to each other also in a different place.
It's my last question for you, Vera, is that if you could give one piece of advice or one sort of strategic direction or something that you would like to be heard by the Israeli government, military in general at large, what would you say to them right now of something you would like to see done right now?
Well, I think right now it's right now is not the right moment to tell people what to do, because I think that there is a military side to this. Yes, there are problems right now that the military needs to solve in military terms. Yes. But one thing that is important for us to remember right now, still when the military mission is still there, is that, and this is really cliche, right? But war is continuation of politics by other means. And then you go back to politics, right? So if there is one thing that I hope our politicians hear is that they will have to, I won't say man up, but they will have to because they have to woman up. But they will have to do their job. Yes, they're being paid for it. They do their job, and they will have to resolve it politically after. The military will do, and everything Barak told us, the military will do their part. Then politicians have to do their part.
I think that the system is so broken. It's set up to be broken, and it fosters schisms within Israeli society. So I suspect very strongly that meaningful conversation will only happen in terms of a commission to find out what went wrong. I don't think that a conversation will happen to systemically change anything, and it will perpetuate Israel's identity of being hyper-reactive and reactive to trauma, to be honest.
Well, actually, to Vera's point is that, I think she very rightly mentioned that nobody will be the same after this. Hamas will not be the same. The Israeli people will not be the same. Vera, do you think that the Israeli voice publicly will change and what they demand from their politicians and government after this?
I think it's already changed. And I think that, I'm pointing to a very painful process that Israel will probably have to undergo, but I feel that this is still, I still have optimism, and I feel that, Barak, if I take your point, I feel that if it's more of the same, it's very pessimistic, because Israel was, when I was there during the summer, I had a very strong feeling that Israel was on the brink of something really bad. Yes. And in October, this really bad thing, it was very surprising in some way. But then it was also not so surprising, because if you think that you're on a brink and then you go over the brink, then why are you surprised? So it's very painful, but I think I think that the months that preceded this terrible war, they prepared people to make really difficult choices. Yes, they prepared people, and Israeli people are tough. You can't really live in that part of the world if you're not tough. So Israelis are tough, and I think that now they just will have to deal with something quite different, which is really to look into the future and what this future holds for us. So I think, it's not easy, but it is, I find it hopeful that these processes will happen and that people will understand the importance of politics and would understand the importance of dialogue and would understand the importance of building alliances. Because 100 and something years of Zionism, you don't just throw them away. It's just the effort, the sacrifice has been too enormous to just chuck it away and say, well, we're just gonna roll with it. We can't just roll with it. We're not going to roll with it.
Vera, thank you so much. What I appreciated, I think this was such a high-level conversation that transcended the political spectrum, and I just found it really probing, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vera. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so this brings us into our segment, What This Means to You. Barak, what does it all mean?
I think that initially people were hoping that the conflict in Gaza would resemble the 2014 conflict, which was localized, and the impact on the global economy was limited. However, there's already signs that this is going to be broader, encompassing not only Gaza, but the West Bank, Lebanon, and also intervention by the Houthis. And it may resemble the 2006 Lebanon war that saw oil prices rise by $5. And prices could rise to around $95 that would increase inflation and slow global growth by 0.3%, which is the lowest growth rate since the 1990s. And if this was to escalate even more and Iran directly intervene and block the Straits of Hormuz, from which 1/5 of global oil supplies pass through, oil prices could reach around $150 per barrel. This would increase global inflation by 6.7% next year and would slow global growth by 1.7%, reducing global output by $1 trillion and contribute to higher inflation and a global recession. Now, at the moment, I see this conflict as relatively local. I see it as perhaps regional, but with local players such as Lebanon, West Bank. I think that America would have to really target Iranian proxies in order to prevent this from escalating. If it doesn't strike at Iranian proxies, it would be setting a precedent that Iran could unleash its proxies and there would be no retaliation, no consequences whatsoever. That could be incredibly harmful for the global economy. So what the US really has to do is deter. America has to deter Iran by striking at its proxies in order to prevent a geopolitical dynamic being affected.
Well, I think we also need to look at the sort of secondary and tertiary effects of the Middle East and the perception for foreign direct investment, right? You have massive mega projects that are going on in Saudi Arabia, such as NEOM, the Red Sea Development Project, and several others that are going on. You have the continued foreign direct investment that's going on in the UAE. And, you know, these are two big powerhouses that are in the Middle East. And you look at the instability that this is creating in the region and the doubt. And does that not affect these ongoing projects? Does it not affect the foreign direct investment or create hesitation in wanting to invest more in the Middle East? Or do you think that right now, I agree with you, it's localized and it's here, but this has the capacity or potential, should we say, to really affect the economies in the Middle East on a wider level?
I agree only to an extent. I wouldn't see its impact on the UAE or Saudi Arabia unless Saudi Arabia wants to get involved in targeting the Houthis, as it has done in the past. But today there was a strike that has been attributed by the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, which links the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. And that area has seen a series of attacks in recent weeks by missiles and drones being launched towards Israel. So
this is my point. Does this not give the kind of green light for all of these other groups to sort of start launching attacks across the board?
So again, that green light will only be given if America and British forces don't at all strike at these proxies to deter them from doing this again in the future.
Well, watch this space, I think, is the word to the wise at the moment then on that.
Yeah.
And let's just hope that doesn't happen. Okay, so this leads us to our last and final segment of the show. Who are the Godfather characters? And Barak, this is so strictly your domain. because I still haven't watched Godfather 2 and 3. So this is definitely all about you.
You're a disgrace. I'm sure I've said that to you many times before. Due to this, as well as other contexts.
No one has time to watch that. That's like 7 hours of my life. I don't even have 7 hours of my life to dedicate to my life.
I'm so envious of you. If only I had that opportunity to dedicate 7 hours to watching it for my first time. I wish I could relive that. So,
oh my goodness. This is turning to a different conversation altogether.
No, look, General Petraeus recently referred to The Godfather Part 3 when he refers to the US that had sought to pivot towards Asia, and now they are getting sucked back in to the Middle East, having 2 aircraft carriers in the region, offering extensive intelligence support to Israel in its fight against Hamas. And he quoted Michael Corleone, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in." And that is America's experience. It would have rather have focused on great power competition with China as opposed to dealing with the huge disruptive impacts that Iranian proxies offer the region. So this is a drain on American attention, and it's not American power best spent, but it has no choice.
Do you know how often I use that quote in my everyday life?
What?
Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is like every day for me on every situation of my life. You could literally apply that quote to any situation and it works.
It's true. Funnily enough, I tend not to. I tend to focus on 1 and 2, but the fact that General Petraeus, the fact that he made that reference, I thought, well, actually,
it was irresistible.
Part three is looking up. Part 3 is looking up.
It was an irresistible way for you to like segue that into our show then. Because now it's giving you validation, and now I'll never live it down. You'll be unbearable to be with at this point now. Yeah.
And now you've got to watch it because Petraeus referred to it.
And no one has time to. I mean, I can barely keep up with the stuff that's on Netflix now. Do you know what I mean? My continue to watch list is like 400 things long. You know, wow. I keep starting things and stopping them. I just need to be able to finish things for once in my life, I guess, on the show watching series. Okay, so I think that wraps us up for today. Please make sure to tune in next week for our episode on the war in Israel, part 2, the Islamist dimension to the conflict, how radicalization affects the day after in Gaza, with special guest Dr. Eran Lerman, former Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the Israeli National Security Council, and what this means for global economies and its everyday impact on you. Until next time, we'll see you then. The Geo-Godfather Wars is an Electricast production. Our executive producers are Leah Tedrow, Barak, Mark Netter, and Peter Rafelson. If you like our podcast, please rate, review, and tell your friends and colleagues to listen in.
Ever thought about starting your own podcast?
Do you have a business or a message you want to share with the world?
Well, now it's easier than ever with Electricast. Hi, I'm Mark Netter.
And I'm Peter Rafelson. We're the founders of Electricast Media.
Whether you want to start a new podcast or already have one, join Electricast to grow your audience, monetize your content, and build your community.
With our simple sign-up, you get free promotion, world-class analytics, premium ads, and personal support.
Go to electricast.com and join our community today.
Electricast. Transform your influence.
Electricast. Welcome to Ringside with Ray and Prince. My name is Ray Leonard Jr.
Oh, is that the set? No, that's just my dad.
My name is Prince Daniels Jr.
Daniels again with a big home touchdown.
On this show, we come to humanize
athletes, entertainers, business executives. We're going to see what makes them tick.
Tuesdays, 10 a.m. Pacific time on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll see you there. Peace and power.
Electricast.